those who have heard my previous lectures know that only the Sanhedrin could establish binding rulings. So you're probably thinking, how can anyone establish anything after their disbandment? Now, although it's true that no one after the Sanhedrin could establish rules binding from a Torah perspective, as was mentioned in Parashat Shoftim, however, from a communal level, Israel still had and has a responsibility to keep the group progressing uniformly, which is what we saw with many leading authorities establishing communal practices from the Reish Galuta to the Geonim, the heads of the two Babylonian yeshivot, which again is known as communal law and not in any way rabbinic or Torah law. So how would communal law differ from rabbinic law? For example, if someone broke communal law, they would not be violating any Torah prohibition, unlike if someone broke a law from the Great Sanhedrin that ruled from the Temple Mount, which would then make them violate the mitzvah of lo tasur, of straying from the rulings of that court, right? That appears in Deuteronomy 17 and other places in Torah. Now, if one broke one of these laws, one of these communal laws, or even rabbinic laws, they would not have to do teshuvah or bring a korban, but they would still be subject to the punishments created by that body that created these laws, whether it was the Sanhedrin or that communal ruling body. But most prevalent between their distinction is the fact that the longevity of the rulings of the Great Court, unlike those of the communal courts, were not limited to time and circumstance. In other words, many ask the question that is actually relevant to Passover as it is to any other Torah holiday, which is, why do we keep a 2-day holiday on these days when the reason for keeping 2 days is no longer relevant anymore? In other words, back then, the whole Jewish calendar was determined by the court, ruling the beginning of the month into existence, a ruling that was determined by witnesses spotting the new moon, and the court ruling based on their testimony. Now, this ruling would not travel fast enough to reach Jews living outside of the land of Israel, so they ruled that everyone outside of its borders should always keep 2 days of a holiday just to be safe, with the exception of Rosh Hashanah, which was even kept for 2 days within Israel. So why do we continue keeping a 2-day holiday, even though nowadays we have greater communication than before? In other words, we could get the word out fast enough. And better yet, why do we continue keeping a 2-day holiday if we no longer have a Sanhedrin? In other words, we don't determine the new month by the moon anymore. We use a calculated calendar, also established by the Sanhedrin, until we actually put them back on the Temple Mount. And the answer is that because it was a ruling by the Great Court, that ruling could not be abolished by any other court but the Sanhedrin itself, which, if you think about it, is the way virtually every legal system functions. And as you know, the prohibition of kiddiyot was only a communal law. Also, like we said earlier, that the problem is that people have really ceased making a distinction between communal law and rabbinic law, which is why I don't think it's so important quoting modern rabbis who happen to agree with eating kiddiyot to prove our point, mainly because you would be falling into the same trap